Okay, thanks, Jane. I guess before we get too far, I just want to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Chinandran peoples. And that's important for us, again, not just as an acknowledgement, but to really understand our role as guests on these territories. And that's in line with our talk today. So gotta open this up. I wanted to just, before I read his bio, just say that I was just reflecting on this as Jane was talking, that, 30 years ago, there was sort of one First Nations architect in Canada, Douglas Cardinal, well, maybe more like 40 years ago, but, and in the United States, there's Dennis Sunroads, but there's literally, you could count them on one hand. And what's really exciting is that across Turtle Island and around the world, Indigenous architects are doing amazing things and evolving critical practice that sort of straddles between sort of conventional architectural trainings that we all received and then also serving communities. And a few years ago, I had a real pleasure to collaborate with Mass Design on a little tiny housing project out in Alberta, and Joseph and I had a chance to work together on that project. And I think he brings such an important voice, not just to Indigenous architecture, but to architects all over. And so I'm really thrilled that when we reached out to him, he accepted our invitation. It's a long flight for him, and he's just saying he's on tour. So I know he's been on a lot of flights recently. So I'll just read through his bio to introduce him. Joseph, a citizen of the Northern Cheyenne Nation, Joseph Kunkel is a community designer and educator focused on sustainable development practices for Indigenous communities. As a principal at Mass Design Group, Joseph directs the Sustainable Native Communities Design Lab in Nogopoge, which is also known as Santa Fe, New Mexico. Joseph's work includes exemplary Indigenous Native American housing projects, such as the Wadi Housing Project, and many others, and I'm sure he'll share some tonight. His research on affordable housing was developed into emerging best practices, leading to an online Healthy Homes Roadmap for tribal housing development funded by HUD, which is the Housing and Urbanism and Development. Okay, office, and that's in the United States, of course. In 2019, Joseph was awarded an Obama Fellowship in recognition of his work with Indigenous communities, and I believe there was a photo out there of you with Obama, which is kind of amazing. In 2018, he received the Rauschenberg Seed Grant from the Robert Rauschenbach Foundation to expand his work in arts-based community development, and a 2019 Creative Capital Award for his work on the Northern Cheyenne Healing Trail. He's a fellow of the inaugural class of the Civil Society Fellowship, a partner of ADL and the Aspen Institute, and a member of the Aspen Global Leadership Network. He's won a bunch of other awards, including the Enterprise Roads Architectural Fellowship, which he just explained to me today is what brought him down to New Mexico. Joseph holds a Master of Architecture in Urban Design from the University of Maryland and a Bachelor of Science in Architectural Engineering from the University of Hartford, where he graduated magna cum laude. So without further ado, I'm really thrilled to have you here. Please welcome Joseph Kunkel.
Good afternoon, good evening. Let me just get a timer going. Track my time. So good evening, Joseph Kunkel. I'm a principal at Mass Design Group. I thought today's talk, I'm going to kind of go in depth on two projects, kind of give a little bit of an overview of what is Mass, and talk a little bit about our practice, but ideally kind of dive a little bit deeply into a project that is nearing completion, and then maybe zoom out a little bit and talk a little bit about our planning work. But yeah, let's dive into it. And so MASS, it's an acronym. It stands for a Model of Architecture Serving Society. We're a nonprofit architecture planning and design firm with offices in Kigali, Rwanda, Boston, Massachusetts, Poughkeepsie, New York, and in Ogepoge or Santa Fe, New Mexico. Ogepoge is the Tewa name for Whiteshell Water Place. So yeah, and this is where our kind of North America offices are located. And I think we continue to kind of similar to David, try and understand where are the lands that we're working on and how is architecture, how is planning, how is design impacting or lifting up those narratives. and we find that to be crucial to how we practice across what is now North America, Turtle. As a nonprofit, our mission is to research, build, and advocate for an architecture that promotes justice and human dignity. As a nonprofit, we work with mission-aligned partners that allow us to kind of explore these ideas, these themes, to promote justice and human dignity. We believe that design is an indispensable tool for economic development, racial justice, climate resilience, and community cohesion. And really thinking about ways in which this is like crucial for how we practice, that architecture is one of our tools to lift up the inequalities that we see in the built environment. So we're just over 120 architects, planners, designers, engineers. We have a film team on staff that help us tell the narratives of our partners. And when I use the word partners, I'm often those in private practice might be considered our clients. And so we try and understand how we're able to communicate the work that they're doing through our narrative team. And so this is just a little bit of where we've worked across the globe, and just where we continue to kind of navigate the work. Our office in Oge-Poge is really focused on the Mountain West. So if you think about the Rocky Mountains westward, that's been our major focus. And we're a small team of 8 to 10 people in Santa Fe. We're a mix of Indigenous designers, non-native designers, and I think that's important to lift up, that we're really focused on building our native and non-native capacity to work in the built environment. Oftentimes when I kind of lifted up earlier this afternoon, that architecture kind of coined the term that architecture is never neutral, it either heals or hurts. And I think that path to healing and that kind of path to thinking about ways in which we can be working in this space is that part of the healing is coming from the non-native side, right? Majority of the people working in Indian country or within our indigenous populations are non-native. And so how do we kind of move that bar to where we're able to lift up both sides of the story? And then particularly the intersection of our native work and abundant futures, which is like food systems, is in this region. So these are a series of projects that we've worked on across the Midwest region, but lifting up ways in which all our work is interconnected. When we think about food systems, when we think about memorials, housing, healthcare, we find this to all be interconnected, and that we can't solve an issue without looking at the broader issues affecting society. And so that's been our modes of working. And our work is really modeled for what sovereign, culturally rooted ecologies, ecological stewardship could look like. Oftentimes when I'm thinking about it, it's like Mother Earth, Father Sky, and how is everything in between impacted in the work that we do, all living things. We can't just think about the ways in which we're impacting humans, but animals, plants, the ecology, the water, everything is interconnected, and we need to be thinking about ways in which that is thought of when we kind of dive into the design of our projects. So can I dive a little bit into the practice itself? And so when we think about traditional practice, a lot of the time we look at it just that green bar, right? Design and construction. The RFP has been written, the request for proposal, the request for qualifications has been issued, and an architect is hired to design and then do the construction administration to get the project through construction. We really look at the project much more upstream. So a lot of our partners we kind of engage with very early on. They're trying to understand that they need a bit more space, or they need a purpose-built space, they need a health clinic, but we often try and back up and ask why. What are the impacts and what are the needs that you see that this piece of architecture can inform or can impact? And how do we help our partners develop that vision? And then we kind of get into the research, the engagement, the design brief, and really start from there. And that allows us to then move forward into design. I kind of mentioned a little bit that we are a nonprofit architecture office. We often are trying to find ways in which we're investing that seed funding early on in the project. And then we get through construction, and I'd say we spend time in this occupancy phase. This is the longest phase of any building, right? And so we often think of the visioning through construction as like that's where the architects really like focused on, but we have to really be thinking about post-occupancy and completion of the building. And so in what ways will our building have impact long after we're gone? And so that connection between people and land is crucial in how we think about a place. Our theory of change requires a proximity and commitment to the approach. So we really think about meeting the community, meeting our partners where they are through accompaniment. And how are we in conversation? In a couple of weeks, I'm going to be going out to a powwow to engage with a tribal community, and we'll be spending basically the weekend there trying to understand what visions do they have for this new village that they're going to build. Like, how do we accompany them through that process? How do we think about different and innovative finance models or financial models to provide strategic investment upfront and long-term investment? Designing and building culturally responsive housing and resilient community infrastructure. And when I use infrastructure, it's like the catch-all, from civic spaces to health spaces to food systems. All that I consider infrastructure that is I'd say historically harmed our indigenous populations. But we have an opportunity to use that as a means for healing. Building native and non-native partnerships, kind of touched on that a little bit earlier. Cultivating the next generation of native leaders in these spaces. And that's all kind of how we're trying to focus our work and build it. This is a little bit of our model. Earned income around 60%, raised income around 40%. When we think about ways in which philanthropy is impacted, we raise about 25% of our budget is philanthropically driven, and then that 70% is income driven. So we are working in traditional means and ways to think about that in the way that we move forward. And all with the kind of notions around, can design, development, and construction, can that process heal? And can we leverage that process for a means of healing? And I think we're optimistic that we can. As we kind of reflect back, and some of you might be familiar with some of these pictures, or these images, or these places, Chaco Canyon, Mesa Verde, places in the Southwest that are kind of embedded in place. And they were designed with the place in mind. And I kind of reckon, like, how do we learn from this? And how do we apply it to the contemporary building practices, contemporary design practices? Because I think they got it right. And in many ways, when we think about the Hogan or the kind of adobe structures or the Pueblo villages, this idea of density, this idea of passive solar aligning with the kind of the land, many of those practices we've started to kind of implement into our contemporary buildings. And I'll share a project that we're doing just that, where we're trying to be as passive as possible. And then I kind of liken the idea is that it's the cherry on top when we're able to add the technology that kind of puts the project over the hurdle. And I would kind of think about ways in which that then has translated to this forced migration with our tribal populations in the United States, or what is now considered the United States, right? This forced relocation onto reservations or reserves, to understand how that has kind of inequitably challenged us as Indigenous peoples, right? And we're really focused, and I PDF'd this. This is a GIF that kind of showed the slow relocation of Indigenous lands over time. But the idea here is that we went from lands that were abundant to very little. There are 574 federally recognized tribes in the U.S. Just over 300 of them have reserves. And so not every tribe in the States has a reservation to call home or to call their own. As an office, we've worked with over 80 tribes. We've also helped supported Indigenous Services Canada on initiatives around Indigenous First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. And we're trying to kind of combine that research, the kind of practice, and writing all in one. And a lot of our work does tend to be the upfront pre-development work, where we're trying to build the capacity of tribes, tribal leaders, tribal housing professionals to do development, and then we selectively take on projects from an architectural perspective. And so these are just some of the projects that we worked on across what is now the US. And so that was a kind of brief overview of MASS, the organization, how we practice, why we practice. I'm going to dive into one specific project with the Caddo Nation. And Caddo is located in present-day Oklahoma, about an hour and a half southwest of Oklahoma City, and we'll kind of get into that a little bit. But as with all projects start with a mission, right? And that mission is in alignment with the organization's mission, but it's really about a mission for the project. So what is this building going to do? How are we going to be thinking about the potential and the impact that this project will have? And with the Caddo Nation, we were tasked with developing a child care center. How is this child care center going to educate and lift up the next generation of tribal leaders? And that was the prompt. Like, what is it about this built piece of architecture? How can that impact that idea? And so we worked with tribal council, the chairman, community members to develop this impact design methodology, we call it, to define that mission. And before we get to that mission, we have to define the method. How will we get there? If we can define that method and implement those methods, we'll inevitably have some semblance of impact, some metric that we'll be able to measure. And if we're lucky, we'll create some semblance of systems change within the larger system. And so with this project, our hope is to empower and support Caddo families by providing culturally rooted holistic childcare that prioritizes the well-being of the whole family. How will we do that? Cultural empowerment, whole health, family first, intergenerational connections, and earth-centered, right? This idea of connecting to place, connecting to environment, and then really kind of diving back down. So if we're able to do that, and I'd say the method is really the architecture, right? That's the building, like that's the how. If we're able to get that building built, what are the impacts that we will see, and how do they very specifically align with those values? So if we look at just cultural empowerment, what is a metric that we can kind of get through from there? And we go down to uplifting cultural identity, number of children who have a sense of their cultural connection to their tribe, right? How many feel like they are growing up in a Caddo environment, a Caddo place? If we think about whole health, we look at nurture well-being of child, like decrease the number of children with diabetes or that are pre-diabetic. And so we're trying to find tangible connections to the implementations of architecture. And so if we're able to kind of achieve all these methods and impacts, maybe there's a systems change in there that we can value and we can think through. So from a systemic change perspective, cultural knowledge is sustained within the community and future Native leaders are created across Oklahoma, right? Now we're getting at the high level that architecture can't really impact directly, but I'd say it's indirectly. This is what architecture can start to do, right? Create a sense of self-worth, find ways in which you can uplift, and maybe they're inspired to do different things within society. Maybe they become leaders regionally, locally, state, at the national level. And so if we're able to kind of do things, we're trying to be very aspirational with the impacts that we're having. So we started with this idea of around long-term planning. We had a 64, 70 acre plot of land where we were going to seed it first with the child care center, right? And so this idea of starting with the child care center and then really starting to think about ways in which we were thinking about housing, tribal governmental offices, market rate housing, a primary school, and trying to all develop that around this rural community. And most of our work is in rural Indian country. We've slowly started to develop, and one of the project that I'll show next is starting to think about urban Native communities. But this project is really focused on the kind of rural, the rural nature of the Caddo Nation. So the design methods and concept. And so really what we started to focus on, how do we kind of reckon back to the ways that the Caddo people built? And thinking about thatch, thinking about layering, in what ways do contemporary materials do that? And we started to look at ways in which we wanted to integrate passive solar, lighting methods, and try and understand ways in which the youth could actually engage with the building. provide support and services to families as foundations for success. And so looking at ways to very diagrammatically program the building. How are you moving through the building? In what ways are you kind of caring for the children? In what ways are they learning? How are they learning? And we basically created these 3 different bars. And then the kind of strengthen those bonds between generations and basically started to program it. And you can kind of start to see these kind of circular programs, both indoor and outdoor. We integrated a rec space, a community pool, a plaza, and started to kind of interstitch them in different ways. And then kind of cultivate deep respect for the environment, connecting the landscape with the building. So the building isn't just about plopping a building down onto the land, but integrating it into the larger ecosystem. And so this was just one of the initial renderings of how we were trying to understand that connection to place. It's a little bit blurry on the big screen. But you can kind of see here, we kind of designed this to be shake and then kind of hardy board. When we were initially thinking about this, we were trying to push the bounds of our carbon footprint as well. We got the okay to do a rubble trench foundation. We know concrete is high embodied carbon, so we tried to minimize our use of concrete in the building, tried to maximize the lighting strategies, and look at ways in which we are trying to integrate that into the larger landscape. As we got to construction, a lot of contractors are very hesitant to do rubble trench foundation. Of course, when we brought down the structure, that was on concrete, but we ended up kind of letting that one go, and we have a full concrete foundation. And so this is the site. This is the site when we started. And then as we kind of got there, I'll show some more pictures of where we are today. But you can kind of see the shakes integrated with the larger building. This is the pool room just behind there. And then culturally specific design, trying to kind of shape the materials, think about the healthy spaces, the support intergenerational link to nature. And so what makes this childcare center community specific? And you start to get a sense of how we're trying to translate that thatch and those designs into architecture. Don't see that image. Let me see, go there. And then thinking about healthy spaces, ways in which we can kind of move air from the low areas to the high areas. We also did integrative lighting studies where we were leveraging these high windows and low windows and the patterning of the windows to bring light into the space. So on a cloudy day, you don't necessarily need to be using artificial light in these spaces. So we're trying to minimize our uses of electricity, minimizing our energy uses while trying to kind of optimize the kind of passiveness of the spaces. What makes the child care center Caddo specific in terms of customs and support, integrating these play spaces, ways in which the children feel like they can move and learn and be cared for in these spaces. Intergenerational thinking, places in which elders can participate and places for elders to be in the space while the children are there so that generational knowledge can be passed down from one generation to another. Links to nature, this is that lake. And so we have paths down to the lake, which is a freshwater lake, but there's fishing, gaming, water games that can be played. And then really thinking about ways in which everything's interconnected in terms of the landscape, in terms of the playground. Out here, you have drop-off pickup, but we're also looking at this as a means to develop energy. So covered parking solar array. Forgot to mention that this, because Oklahoma is, and this location is in the middle of Tornado Alley, this is a FEMA or Federal Emergency Management rated storm shelter. So you have a use a 3-foot wide concrete wall. It's reinforced with rebar. It can withstand a pretty big tornado. The pool room, so water play, indoor water play year round. This will be one of the only facilities in the Caddo community that will have this type of water play. Forgot to also mention that this facility is the first time that they're building a building since the 1960s. of this scale. And so it's a major endeavor. This is the gym, the classroom spaces, thinking about ways in which the children can play. The library spaces. This is also a place for intergenerational learning, kind of located across the move bar, which goes north-south, and ways in which you can kind of think about that. The outdoor playground spaces, in terms of how they can integrate play and be outside and connected more to nature. The learning gardens, which will also be a place where medicines and vegetables are harvested and grown, and so on. So these are just some of the initial renderings that you just saw, but a little bit larger. The window strategies are not random in the sense. So when I kind of alluded to the lighting studies, this allows light to bounce off the various surfaces inside to naturally daylight these spaces, and think about them in ways. And we use soft materials. We tried to, one thing that was innovative in terms of the construction, and I'm going to share a video in a moment that kind of lifts up the construction, but the Caddo Nation basically developed their own construction company, and we helped them develop a construction company to build this project themselves, about a $12 million, $13 million project US. And they basically were able to kind of turn those dollars and have those dollars stay within the community. And we did it in a way that we leveraged residential contractors rather than commercial contractors, mainly because we just there was more access to residential contractors that could do a different type of construction and open it up from a financial perspective, and lower construction costs. So just some of this would be a movable wall. You can kind of close this space down for one space or two spaces. And then I think I share some, share the video so you get the sense of some of the voices themselves.
I was told that kids are not given to you so that you can raise them. They're given to you so that they can raise you.
And that worldview is informed by these values and beliefs that go all the way back to our origin stories about take care of each other, be good to each other, be kind to each other, look out for each other, teach each other. That's ancient.
All of Northeast Texas, all of Southwest Arkansas, all of Northwest Louisiana, all of Eastern Oklahoma is our Aboriginal homeland. So where we're at today is our tribal jurisdiction recognized by the United States government and Congress. However, our hearts and minds are in our homelands as well.
Because we're all different tribal nations, First Nations, Aboriginal groups, the effects of colonization are felt throughout the world. And it's caused a lot of historical trauma.
I'm looking at and remembering the children that are currently in our camp and their family journeys that kind of brought them here. And then what parts of Native American history have they been affected by, right? Was it boarding schools? There's some families that have been a part of the Relocation Act.
Back in the early 80s when it started, we had nothing. I mean, we were starting from the bottom, nothing, just that little shack building we had.
The number one thing was we want a building. How do we get a building?
We are willing to do the extra work to deliver the best for our children.
Every single thing we try to do is quality to make sure that we're setting the standard. We're not just giving people the bare minimum.
The tribe, their vision and forward thinking, and Mass Design Group who came on board, that relationship with them was invaluable. The accessibility that we're providing families is empowering because our families just usually don't have access to the quality of care that they're going to be receiving from this facility.
Ensuring that there's a library so that if a mother is going to school or if she is taking night classes, if she wants her child to go to the facility and she wants to go in that library and study, then you don't have to leave the facility to go somewhere else. You can actually be there with your child.
It is very much geared towards community and kind of intergenerational learning and children learning within community.
They have the elders come in and tell stories to them and teach them the traditions and the cultures of our people, because a lot of the children don't get that from their parents.
We are in a farming community, and our own children that we're sending to schools have no context to the fields that they're driving by on a daily basis. I want our children to understand what healthy food options are. I want them to understand why they're healthy food options.
Having an area where people can play basketball, play sports, do things like that, having a garden.
We have 7 tribes that have their headquarters within a 40-mile radius that have their own populations that have completely different structures and cultures.
When the child care team started talking about constructing this facility, one of the things that I knew right away is that we have to build it ourselves. And the way that we can do that is by creating the avenue in the business to make it work. And by doing that, we're turning the money back over and keeping as much of the resources within our community, within our tribe. We're going to construct with federal dollars. We're going to buy the land with federal dollars and marry them up. And then we're going to create a company that creates a subsidiary that builds it. And we're going to turn the dollars over and hire our own people and train them at the same time. And when you put your minds together and they're all on the same page, then it becomes reality. And you just go to work and keep that faith.
All of our efforts are culminating in the fact that more Caddo people want to come home and be involved. And we couldn't ask for anything more than that, because tribal participation is really the end goal to everything that we're doing.
We have had to be resilient for so long, providing a safe space for children to set their baggage down that they don't even realize they have, and the families to come in and just be happy with their kids is what I hope for in this space, because they're going to have to go out in the world and continue to be resilient.
When I'm no longer here, and I move on to that other world after leaving this earth here that I'm passing through, this place will be here for the future.
Hey, do you think you'll be chairman? You think so?
I'll make the tribe better.
And so this is where we are 3 months ago, project. And this is Arrowwood is the general contractor, data, which is the tribe's economic development. They're the ones that have been the general contractor working for time. And you can shakes, how they wrap the learning bar. Some trails over time. Shakes as a interstitial or so wanted to touch on one more project. So we're going from, we take on some very specific architecture projects. We don't take many projects through architecture. We're pretty selective in terms of those projects, but we do a lot of planning and pre-development work. And here we're working with the City of Albuquerque Office of Equity and Inclusion to focus on urban native populations and African Americans, looking at ways in which the housing market just hasn't served these two populations. And so we were developing a strategy for the mayor's office and for the Office of Equity and Inclusion to better understand how can we get home ownership into their hands. And we developed 2 analyses, of an assessment report and a site and planning and analysis report. The kind of needs assessment was basically just reinforcing, I'd say, what the community already knew, but the governing body needed something in writing from a professional to kind of qualify what the community was saying. So everything that we defined in needs assessment was just reinforcing with data what people were seeing on a day-to-day basis. Then we took that information and basically started to assess properties that the city had access to, the city owned, to do studies around housing and how can we think about a small, medium, large development. And so with the city of Albuquerque, they do have their land acknowledgement, but they're also acknowledging more than 12 million African American ancestors who were stolen from their homes, their tribes, and their families. So this idea of kind of acknowledging both spaces, both indigenous and labor acknowledgement. In the States, over 70% of our indigenous populations live in and or around urban centers. This is also due to the Relocation Act in the 1960s. And I'd say it's very similar to what we're seeing. And so the goal here was to identify, and this is similar, we did an impact design methodology similarly with the city, and our goals were to identify opportunities and challenges around culturally responsive, healthy home ownership and small business growth for Black and Native Americans. And this goal was looking at ways in which we could basically influence policy and influence ways in which the governing body does govern in these spaces. And so what we've learned is that over the last 2 years, housing inventory decreased. The general housing inventory decreased by 30%. And I'd say this is very much due also to COVID and people moving around during the pandemic. Households of color in Albuquerque are less likely to own their homes than white households. And it's kind of very clear in the data. 16% of Black adults ages 18 to 45 don't have the credit characteristics needed to qualify for a mortgage. I'd say for the indigenous populations, there's no data, which is also a big flag. In many spaces, we don't have data for our tribal populations. And part of the reasoning is that what we're being told is that the sample sizes are too small. Our indigenous populations in the state make up around 2% of the national population. And so we basically, in our most recent work, had to do the data collection and the sampling ourselves and not rely on census data. The gap between Black and Native and white homeownership will continue to grow without aggressive policy changes. That was like one of the major outcomes. Like if we don't do anything, this issue is going to get exponentially larger, and so we need to act today. And so this is like, it's about the inability to achieve home ownership. It's also about challenges on the supply side, a lack of affordable housing. It's about the households of colors can't benefit from home ownership because they own lower value homes. They own less home equity. How can we change this so households of color can benefit from home ownership? And this is redlining. I don't know how many of you are familiar with redlining. This is redlining without calling it redlining, right? So the home across the tracks is worth less than the house over on this side. And that's just because it's the Black neighborhood, or that's where the indigenous or the urban natives live. And so we had to kind of try and reconcile that and think about that. And also challenge the city to, where do you own land? Do you own it in a wealthier neighborhood? Can we develop some urban native housing there? So we tried to kind of call that out. And when we engaged and what we heard are things that I'd say every community wants, right? What is your dream community? Primary roads, streets, access to shops, coffee shops, places to eat, access to parks, rec, safety, low crime, friendly communities. I mean, I'd say this is like what everybody wants. Similarly, the Native community, high quality assets, friendly and quiet, low crime, nature, parks. And so this is not rocket science. This is like, we're basically saying things that the people already know. And then out of some of this engagement, we kind of developed these guiding principles. Financial health, how do we develop financial health within these populations? Looking at family and community cohesion, looking at home and health, and then these became subcategories, right? Financial sustainability, entrepreneurship, access to financing, creating a sense of community, sense of safety, ecology, well-being, proximity to health services, education. And then we basically kind of zoomed out. And so we started to kind of look at the scale of the city, looking at ways in which, what are the resources adjacent to potential developments, and then started to diagram them, something that you would maybe do in a site analysis in your design studio. Where are the bus stops? Where are the grocery stores? Where are the parks? Where are the trails? And started to basically just call them out. And what you see in the center is a plot of land that the city owns. Like, this might be an ideal spot for a medium-sized development, a 40 to 60 unit development. And so we started to rank it, look at ways in which we're giving it a potential ranking. Is it a high possibility for development? And then in the States, I mean, so why would the city give a piece of land? It's the highest piece of subsidy that the city can give, right? We don't have to factor in the cost of land. If we don't have to buy a 5-acre piece of land, that will help subsidize, and that money will go more towards construction and the soft costs that will help develop it. And then we ended up doing some planning, really quick planning studies, and trying to look at single family detached, attached or row house style, or apartment style. So just trying to kind of do some ratios and do some quick performance to understand what are the potentials to maximize the site. And looked at this in like small, medium, and large types of lots to understand what are the potentials, and look at them in ways that maybe address some of the critical issues that the city was hoping to solve. And so at the end, we basically, like, what does this report tell me if I were a city department, a policymaker, a housing developer, a community organization? Like, what are ways in which I would be able to use this? And I think one of the most innovative things that the city did is made this report available online. They basically made it transparent. And so if you as a community organizer want access to this information, you have access to it. And so the ability to be transparent about serving or sharing information became really important. So I have one final video. The work with the city of Albuquerque.
My grandmother tells the story of buying this house after World War II, and all of her neighbors told them go back to where they came from. And my family's from here, like 450 years from here. There wasn't redlining per se in Albuquerque, but people of color weren't welcomed in certain parts of town. Now we have equity in our house that I've been able to use to help put our girls through college. That is our path to closing the racial wealth gap, but not everybody has that opportunity.
We don't have enough housing to support the housing need here in Albuquerque. That's particularly true for our Native American population.
That's why we do the work that we're doing now to try to make those opportunities much more accessible.
Every day we get calls from constituents. They could need rental assistance, housing searches. What type of data do we need, or do we have that can show what the need is? In Albuquerque, we didn't have a lot to go off of.
So what we're doing is we're working together with our Native and Black communities to really dream about what a development would look like for us.
So the partnership with Mass Designs was collect this information and help us understand as designers and as builders and planners, how do we transition from doing emergency response to envision a future and incorporate community input into it? What would it look like?
So we're doing community engagement, listening to some of the people in our communities that do the work of developing. What kind of things are important for our community? Where do we want to live in our city? And what type of things are unique that we look for in homes that we can't find?
That's really what the needs assessment is.
That's a tool.
A framework to help us start getting more questions answered. What are we trying to build? What's the city's role in all of this?
Sometimes it takes another level of intervention for people of color to get their first house.
Basically, where we're with that project is just trying to better understand what ways, I mean, this turned into a Mayor's Institute on City Design conversation where we invited mayors from across the US that have large urban native populations, kind of challenge them to, are you thinking about urban native population in your city development? Now the mayor of Albuquerque is pushing and proposing ways to prop up and lift up local community development corporations to focus on this issue around urban native displacement, wealth generation, wealth gaps. Yeah, happy to open it up to conversation, questions. So,
Okay, thank you so much, Joseph. That was excellent. Getting a peek into the day-to-day world of Mass and the kind of work that they're doing. I think I'd like to just see if anybody's been sitting on a question that you'd like to ask before I go ahead. Anybody got their hands up? I mean, I guess I wanted to ask one thing, particularly on this last few slides, when we're talking about income gaps and home ownership. I'm wondering, you know, Adrian Blackwell and I and a group from across the country here, we're looking at, you know, different kinds of housing models like land trusts and co-ops and those sorts of things. And I'm wondering about, obviously, building equity through home ownership has been a primary means of wealth accumulation that, as you pointed out, Black and Indigenous folks have been left out of that conversation. But is there a future or conversations happening, for instance, on like tribal owned co-ops and those sorts of things to kind of lift people up that doesn't necessarily have to rely on home ownership?
Yeah, I think the short answer is yes. I think the ability to leverage land trusts, co-ops is a really good way to enter into the housing market and look at ways in which that could be both a way for entry and, for lack of a better term, like end of life. And I think trying to figure out how we can kind of develop that missing middle is also important. And it's a balance of like how our tribe, I mean, there are many tribes, Caddo, for instance, Caddo bought that land, that's fee simple land, that's not tribal trust, that's not trust land. And their hope is that they're able to build equity within the Caddo Nation. but put some LoRa on it that only allows tribal members to kind of engage in building wealth or building their housing. I think tribes need to be innovative. I think land trust is one tool. I don't think rental housing is a bad thing. I think given where we are with the cost of capital in some markets, rent is important, and to have that kind of housing typology is important to have. And so I think they're all tools in our tool chest to develop with. It just, how do you leverage it and where do you leverage it?
Yeah, I think there's lots of, I mean, urban reserves and these things are sort of happening all over the place. I also just think it's, yeah, I mean, the 2% of the population of the United States is Native American. Is that what you said?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's also a very interesting statistic to, you know, to, in some ways to think in from a reparative perspective. Same thing up here in Canada, right? Like trying to play catch up when you're at 2% of the population and on such a small fraction of the land is quite a feat.
Yeah.
Anybody having a question that you're sitting on here? Yep, go for it. I think I could, well, here.
Yeah.
Yeah, just go for it.
I can hear you. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the question, when we do these studies, are they the ability to bring or acknowledge the issues or bring solutions to the city? Did I get that question right? Yeah, so speculation versus concreteness, like how real is it? I would say the studies, I think, are more speculative, right? And so we were tasked, and I think the housing needs assessment was meant to inform the general public, and it was to inform city council. And it's basically a policy tool. It was really meant for the mayor and city councilors. The site analysis and I'd say the speculative report number 2, is just that. And we also, as part of the recommendations, came up with recommendations. Does the city want to be the developer? Do you want to prop up a local native-led organization? Do you want to create a community development corporation? Do you want to put out an RFP for development for for-profit developers? And we basically outlined scenarios. Like you can basically ask a developer to put together a proposal on said site. You're going to basically give this site away, and can you get an interesting development from a developer that could develop it? And a for-profit developer is going to prioritize profit. Nonprofit will need to cover their costs. And community development corporations similarly, but might not have to follow that suit in so ways. But they would end up developing their own plan for said site. We just basically, it's like, this is one version. And in terms of implementation and like, how do you implement it? We basically, like, this is the cost. This might be the subsidy or the set aside that the city will put aside to develop said development. But yeah, tax incentives, bonds, infrastructure costs the city might cover. So just putting all that out on the table, and it's really up to city councilors, their constituents to approve it or down.
Well, I'm just looking for hands. Put your hand up if you've got something. Okay, thank you. I'm gonna come to you after my question, if you don't mind. You mentioned a few times the nonprofit way that Mass works in, and you had a slide there, and I might have been off on this, but was the pie chart sort of showing us 60% comes from kind of normal fees and 40% is coming from philanthropy? Is that what you said? I mean, I think that's a really interesting model, and I'm curious if you can allow, you know, I think just talking to many students over the years, there's a often a perceived gap between the kind of ideals that they believe in terms of their own practice and agency, and then sort of the reality of getting in that first firm and you know, being pushed through your schematic design like we were talking earlier so quickly. Whereas in some cases, particularly in cultural context, that schematic design is the most meaningful time you have is to do something that's not so rushed. I'm just wondering if you could expand from as an Indigenous practitioner on the model, and like if you didn't have that philanthropic part of the pie chart, could you do the kind of work that you're doing? And is this a path forward that more people should be looking at in particularly like the mass model, which is, you know, architecture as a service to lift people up, because traditional modes of practice seem to be somewhat in conflict with that model.
Constrained. Yeah, I think that's a tough one, because I would like to say that we're moving model of architecture serving society. I mean, our hope is that we're moving practice in this way, not the for-profit, nonprofit world, not this kind of tension between for-profit and nonprofit. But I think we're hopeful that the kind of for-profit would see the benefit of doing this type of work and that it can happen in a for-profit space. Do we need more nonprofits? It's a hard model to practice. I mean, I'd say a majority of my time is focused on fundraising, talking to funders, doing a lot of admin and administrative work. I maybe 10-15% of my time is focused on design and planning and policy writing. Majority of my time is focused on the operations of the organization. And so hopefully we can shift that and we kind of grew exponentially, and because we were a lot larger, a lot more of my time is focused on admin. I think as we're starting to kind of right size and shrink a little bit, more of my time might be able to focus on design work and planning work. And I'm just hopeful that, that would happen. I can't say, should there be more nonprofits? I think government, I think we need more, well, I do think we need more subsidy from foundations, from government to invest more upfront in pre-development work. I think that, and to get more architects involved in pre-development, I think is really important. It shouldn't be the act of the developers. And so that's where I see as a potential opportunity.
That's great. Thank you.
I want to start by saying thank you for your presentation. Your work is exactly the reason that I am so interested in architecture and why I find it so inspiring. My question is related to timelines and how you manage your time as a firm that relies on different sources of income. How do you sort of balance the time that you spend researching and analyzing and talking to communities with the actual design work? Because that work comes with the cost of your time and your labor. How do you manage that balance? And do you think that more firms should be doing this heavy research before making designs?
The short answer is yes. I do think we need more time in community. When I think of like the civic architect or the person that is building buildings in the civic realm or in community, it can't be the all-knowing architect. I'd say the community knows the community better than us as outsiders. And so how do we understand who we're designing with? And I underscore with, because we're not designing for, we're not an outsider. This is what you should build. And so I do think we need more time. And that's where it kind of go back to, yes, our time is money and we need to be paying ourselves equitably. And so how do we pay for that? Getting back to David's question, we pay most of that upfront money through philanthropy. And I would argue that we need to value design more. We need to be asking for the fees up front, and we need either government or private developers to pay for that time so that whatever we end up building is serving the community in a better way.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks very much for the lecture. How does Mass Design Group organize itself differently than other firms in order to do this work? Like what kind of activism has to happen within the firm, or like restructuring needs to happen to make the firm operate differently?
Yeah. One of the co-founders, Alan Ricks, often is quoted saying the kind of largest or the longest running design project is the design of our firm. And that's sometimes, I think that keeps us innovative in terms of how we practice. I think it also causes a lot of headaches because we're constantly trying to question how we're practicing, why we're practicing, what are we doing, what are we researching, what are we writing, how are we getting work out the door, and how are we pushing practice. And I'd say what is different from our practice is that we do have the ability and we do have funding that is paid for. Like we have the ability to write internally. So similarly, like a lot of the principals are tasked with writing and writing op-eds or thinking about how we practice. What is the next? And we have 6 different labs within Mass. One of them, the Sustainable Native Communities Design Lab. We have the Abundant Futures Lab. We have Memory and Memorial, and they're all topical areas that we think it's important to be pushing within the built environment. And it's an area of practice that we think is critical for society, maternal and newborn health. All these areas that I think have a critical social component that we see a deficit in. And I think that's where our model of practice is different from a traditional practice, because we're not going after housing projects per se, or we're not going after a typology. We're kind of understanding the critical issues in society and trying to understand how is architecture either contributing negatively or positively to those issues. And that's where I think we are different.
Does that affect the hierarchy within the firm? Relationship between partners and
Well, because we're a nonprofit, we don't have any partners. We have a board of governors, we have a board of directors who are non-employees, and then we have 3 co-EDs, co-executive directors, and one executive director is based in Kigali, the other 2 are based in Boston. The 2 that are based in Boston, one's focused on operations and the other is focused on the practice. And then we have principals that some are design principles, and some are principals that lead a lab or lead a body of work. And so I'm the principal and director of the Sustainable Native Communities Design Lab. We have a principal that's in charge of memory and memorials. We have a principal that leads our newborn and maternal health. We have a principal that's focused on abundant futures or sustainability, and so they're kind of charged with developing those narratives and trying to understand how do we work in these spaces.
Thank you very much. The 2 projects which you presented take very different approaches to supporting community. From what I understood, like the first one is a public space where people are sharing, and the land is owned collectively by a nation. Whereas the second one was supporting individuals. I was wondering if you could provide some more insight into those approaches, and kind of how much control you have over the approach that you take to supporting communities, or whether the projects just come to you. And then if there was an ideal approach in regard to like economics and design, what that would be.
Yeah, I mean, they're 2 totally different projects, and I think that's what's exciting. Caddo is about like lifting up a population, lifting up the next generation of tribal leaders, and that's like more of a collective action. Albuquerque housing, the housing work is about lifting up individuals and trying to kind of play with this tension. I mean, it's how do you operate in a capitalist society, and how do you create and generate wealth in a society that has historically left you out of the conversation. And I think both conversations are really important, and we need to be addressing them at different levels. And so how do we navigate that in terms of like do the projects come to us, or do we go after a project? I'd say these two projects in particular, we've developed the relationships over time. The city heard of us and our planning work and wanted to work with us directly. And so they had a grant that they were able to acquire, and then they brought us on to deliver the work. Similarly, Caddo Nation was in one of our funding regions. So one of our philanthropic partners funds in their state, and we were able to allocate a percentage of funding to the project, to some resiliency planning work, and then that allowed us to kind of dive a little bit more deeper. They had grant funding to move the project forward, and basically we're really excited about this work. We want to work with you. There are projects that we go after RFPs, so we do go after projects as well. I'd say we're not as successful. We're 15 years old this year, and I'd say we're not very old in terms of practice, and I think that in some ways is a benefit, but also a negative, because we haven't done 20 hospitals to get a hospital project, or we haven't done 50 schools to prove that we can design a school. I'd say nothing is outside of our design realm. I think we can do anything. That's the kind of optimism in me. I don't think anything's outside of our bounds, but we don't have the portfolio to lift that up. So that's also a challenge when we go after work, per se.
I had not seen any hands. I had another question about oh, sorry, whose hands up? Oh, thank you. Hiding from me. I'll come back up this way.
Sorry, I'm small. Okay. I found it really inspiring when you were talking about how you're designing with the community instead of for the community. I think it's a great way to like make sure that your design's actually working with the context of who you're designing for. And I was wondering what some of the feedback you've gotten from that is, because I did see some of your slides, especially for the childcare center, when you had a picture of you showing like the project vendors to the kids themselves and them giving feedback on that. And so I know that one of the common criticisms is that when things are designed by council, ideas kind of get muddied together and budgets get cut and whatever. So I was wondering if you could speak to some of the challenges that have occurred when you were designing with the feedback and this dialogue from you're working with.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'd say consensus is yeah, we can't come to consensus. Design in some ways will always be subjective. And so how do we leverage our skills as architects, as designers, to move a design forward? I think very early on, we were like, we're gonna present 3 options. And I think we've kind of moved away from that when we got to a point, because the client partner would be like, we like all those options. How do you merge them all together? And we're like, well, this really is about X, Y, and Z. This is where A, B, C, D. This is something totally different. We can't really just make a Frankenstein out of these 3 concepts. And so we've basically, and that's where we've leveraged the impact design methodology to really try and take the subjectivity out of the design process and say, we're trying to address X, Y, and Z in these various issues. And so when we talk about the developing a narrative around the design problem, that's why the impact design methodology is really important when we kind of present back our design. And so we're trying to test that subjectivity. We have had issues where we go back and we're like very early on, we'd hit our heads against our desks and we're like, how do we do this? Like, we can't keep designing. So, well, we could do that to infinity. Like, the design process could go on forever, and we've got to put some guide rails on it.
And that you've often been given feedback or requests that you're like, really work with this, or like really difficult feedback to manage?
We've gotten, I'd say we haven't gotten feedback where we don't like this. I think we often are more critical to ourselves, and we find ourselves to be more critical, like, oh my God, I don't know, like this. And then they love it. And then that's always a happy happy ending. But I think there are like we just opened a project in Bismarck, North Dakota, a memorial, and one of the partners was like, I didn't think it was going to look like this. And we're like, is that a good thing? And it made us like hold our breath. And she's like, I love it. Like, I didn't think it was going to be as like raw as was in the renderings. And that was a happy.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Questions remind me of once getting a youth consultant section, and it was great because the kids wanted like bowling alleys and swimming pools, and so sometimes they're the toughest clients because you can't put everything they want in the building. Anybody else got their hand up?
Your second project in Albuquerque focused more on raising awareness about housing inequalities regarding Black and Indigenous Americans. And you mentioned wanting to influence existing bias zoning bylaws and policies that unfairly target these groups. How likely do you think that government can implement the suggestions that you suggested in your proposal?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It's a tough question. I think it's all dependent on the city leadership and the city's leadership and partnerships with the surrounding tribal community. I think so. We're in an election year, and so the mayor is up for re-election. He's really pushing some of these policies, and he's using them to try and energize the community to come out and vote. And so that's kind of where we get kind of caught in between like politics, policy, and like implementation. So I'm hopeful if he is reelected that this work would continue moving forward. Fear is that if he's not reelected, project and the work be nothing. And so that's a challenge. And yeah, that's a tough one to swallow if way we don't expect it to go.
I just had one final question that I wanted to, and it's probably too long for the few minutes we have left, but I was curious if you've reflected much. You mentioned Mass is 15 years old, and they kind of set up in Kigali initially, right? And a lot of their early work was, I think one of the things that, it reminds me of like kind of the Francis Carey model, where there was a lot of like correlation between local labor, jobs, and kind of almost like an economic catalyst within those sites. And I've always been a little skeptical about that model as it moves over to Turtle Island, because it's just it's a little bit more difficult to, for instance, to spark a new trade, because in the communities, if I look at most of the work on reserves, I mean, I don't know what percentage are done by actual First Nations people on reserves. And so like, I'm always just wary of this kind of economic leakage that happens here, and the lack of like actual stimulation that happens through building projects like it can happen in Africa. And I've been, I know Kenya pretty well, and there are other places in the world where that can happen. But I wondered, in your work and your experience in the projects that Mass is doing now, because I've always loved that cycle model that they've put together there. But is there like long-term kind of labor? Are you seeing aspects of that, which is, I think, part of Mass's, a main part of their value system, I think, is to, or is it still more at the level of we're going to design something that's, the building facilitates things? But I guess I'm very interested in the production and where Native Americans fit into that production.
Yeah, I mean, and I think the model of Caddo is maybe the most directly correlates to the work in Kigali. Where Caddo is not like, they're not laborers, they're not skilled and unskilled laborers doing the work, but they are the general contractor. And I think the general contractor is a more comfortable place to be when it comes to locally fabricated. So how do they create a construction company and then subcontract out skilled and unskilled labor? And I think that's a place we could innovate around. I mean, it's probably similar here in Canada where they're like our skilled laborers are aging out. For every one master electrician that leaves the industry, it's like for every one we have like 0.3 of one, or it's something where we just don't have them being replaced. And I think that there is an opportunity there, but I think we're way behind. It's not our job to be training like we did in Kigali, but we can do. And I think part of it is just how professionalized the construction industry is. The trades are very well organized, and we can general manage it, and that's what Cato's doing.
No, that's great.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. That's a great answer. And yeah, it's much more restrictive, let's just say, than it probably is. Okay, well, I just wanted to thank everybody who put up their hands and stayed and listened. I want to thank Joseph again for joining us. What an inspirational talk. And please keep coming to the lectures and please keep asking questions. So thanks to Jane and the committee. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you.